There are certain people in life who will risk it all for a cause that they believe in. And when they do, sometimes they get the term whistleblower applied to them. Now, many of us have talked about whether or not that is a term that is of endearment or a term of strength. Prefer to see it as a term of strength. It's standing up and sticking your neck out when others won't. Welcome to the podcast, Ted.
Thank you.
So today, yeah, I'm glad to have you here. So today we're going to be talking about speaking up, speaking out, and we will be discussing something that a lot of people don't understand and don't know what does happen within the Department of Veterans Affairs. So today we're talking to Ted Blickwedel. He is a retired Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel, combat veteran, and licensed clinical social worker. And as I said, he risked it all to expose a critical issue within the Veterans Affairs system. He began his journey at the VA Vet Center in Warwick, Rhode Island, providing mental health care to fellow veterans from 2009 to 2018. But in 2017, he witnessed how harmful clinical productivity practices were jeopardizing the well-being of counselors and the quality of care for veterans. When his concerns were repeatedly dismissed by supervisors, he decided to speak out, initiating a whistleblower campaign that came at a tremendous personal cost. However, his efforts led to a federal investigation by the Government Accountability Office, which substantiated his claims and ultimately sparked legislation signed into law. So today, on the 164th episode of the Stories of Service podcast, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work, we will dive into why Ted chose to expose those issues despite the risks, the legal, financial, and health challenges he faced as a whistleblower, the impact of his advocacy on veterans, counselors, and VA leadership nationwide, and lastly, his book, Broken Promises, which chronicles the injustices and retaliation he endured while fighting for change. His story has not only been featured in numerous podcasts, but also on NBC, NPR, Military Times, and is a powerful testament to courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of justice. Welcome again, Ted.
Thank you.
So first off, I always start these podcasts with, where were you born and raised, and what made you decide to raise your right hand and join the military?
Yes, so I was born in 1955 in a place called Emporium, Pennsylvania, in Cameron County, barely noticeable on the map, and had gone to Penn State University, where I received my undergraduate in psychology, and then a master's in social work with an emphasis in rehabilitation. And subsequently, I decided to go into the military. I wanted to have an opportunity to serve for a while before moving on with as a patriot. Before moving on with the rest of what would be my professional career. Not knowing whether I would stay in or get out, but I ended up staying in the military over a 27-year period, not continually in active duty with broken time along the way. And most of my active duty time was done out of the individual ready reserves in a program called Active Duty Special Works, or ADSW, where I did most of my assignments, which extensively was overseas.
What was your job in the Marine Corps?
I was a logistics officer, and on the ground side, my last 7 years, I actually served in combat arms billets, some of it logistically, some of it not, and ended up as the TUM FG4 ops officer down at Camp Lejeune. It's my last tour before I retired from the military in 2006.
But you always had an interest in psychology, it sounds like, and you didn't take that path in the military. And so when you decided to transition, was it clear in your mind that you were going to pursue social work?
Yes, because interestingly, as part of my broken time, when I actually retired for the first time from the Marine Corps in 2000, I ended up working in a local community-based mental health clinic and substance abuse clinic, doing dual treatment with clients for about 2 years. Had a very good experience with that at the time, and it was clear to me that once I got out of the military, I would pursue those avenues once again. And interestingly, what happened is after 9/11, I got a call from headquarters Marine Corps asking for me to come off the retired list to go back on active duty, which I did for about another almost 3 years in 2 different assignments, one out of Okinawa, Japan, and then at Camp Lejeune for my last tour.
Wow. I mean, 27 years is a long time. I'm at 28 years, and it's just crazy to think that you could serve for that long. Was there ever a time that you were wanting to just to stop, or what was it like to be in for all those years?
I just took it a day at a time, a year at a time, and certainly there were bumps in the road along the way, and you question whether you're going to keep going or not. But overall, it was a good experience in spite of the challenges, and it's something that, frankly, my last 2 tours in the Marine Corps are actually my most rewarding. In fact, so I'm glad I stuck it out to the end and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 2006 when I went back to school again to get my master's in clinical social work before starting to work for the VA in January of 2009 in the Vet Center program in Warwick, Rhode Island.
Yep. So what made you decide to settle down in Rhode Island? Did you have family there, or was there a tie there in some other capacity?
Well, actually, most of the deployments I did in my latter years in the Marine Corps, because it was under the Active Duty Special Works program, I actually did that home based out of Rhode Island. So I was kind of already here. So when I graduated from my MSW program and ended up doing an internship in the VA, subsequent to that, it just made sense to be able to work with veterans. I'm already in the area, and a position opened up in the Vet Center here in Warwick, Rhode Island, and that's where I started in January of 2009.
So for those of you who don't know what a Veterans Affairs Vet Center is, Ted, can you help our audience understand that a little bit better?
Sure. It's a community-based outpatient program. They don't have doctors on hand or psychiatrists. There's licensed clinicians. The program actually started in 1979. It was sanctioned by Congress, and initially just for Vietnam veterans. And over the years and after the Persian Gulf War, they opened it up to other branches of service. It was all branches of service to begin with for Vietnam veterans, but they opened it up to virtually all war eras, where anybody that had served in country overseas in a conflict was eligible to receive services at the Vet Center, which, by the way, had the Vet Center program, or the Readjustment Counseling Service, as it's officially called, has its separate chain of command under the Veterans Health Administration than the VA medical centers themselves. So there's the medical centers, the Vet Center program, both of which fall under the Veterans Health Administration.
Gotcha. And most states have a vet center. Is that correct? And they're by states, or
all states have vet centers.
All states have a vet
even
center.
Puerto Rico, and I believe they may even have one in Guam, but I know they do in Puerto Rico.
And people can go to the vet center for counseling. What else can they go there for?
Well, basically, that's what it's for, to help veterans in their readjustment back to civilian life, especially having been in a conflict area, in a war zone. And they've expanded their services over the years to family members of veterans as well, and even bereavement counseling for families that have lost a member, in combat. They've opened it up to active duty people at this point as well, and even extended it to National Guard, personnel. I
did not know that active duty can go to a vet center.
Yeah. They that happened, about several years ago, 7 or 8 years ago. I think they opened it up to active duty members.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about what it was like working there. Now we'll get into your story a little bit. Initially, like the first, because you were there for quite a number of years. So tell me
9 years, right?
Yeah,
from
9 years.
2009 to 2018.
Yep.
It was great. And in terms of, what I did, I frankly, is probably the best job I ever had. I was doing individual group therapy with combat veterans and meeting reasonable, standards of care and productivity expectations until things went awry. About around 2016, actually.
And what happened in 2016?
So what occurred is they came out with a memorandum with expectations increasing the visit count requirement for counselors, and it was inundated with threats of HR action if you didn't meet the requirements of the production expectations, and they were excessive. It goes against what the research shows is healthy and how it can adversely affect treatment outcomes when you have more than 25 visits a week, and they were expecting 30 visits a week. Admittedly, and to their benefit, that a lot of that could be done by groups, but a lot of places, groups weren't necessarily clinically relevant in some vet centers, and certainly the clients I was dealing with, most of them wanted to do one-on-one and not groups. So the pressure was on me and other counselors in similar situations to get those visit counts primarily, through one-on-one face-to-face sessions, which basically, impeded, the other requirements administratively and everything else they wanted done. A lot of people were, not taking breaks, working through lunch, working overtime on their own time, not being compensated to do the progress notes, treatment plans, so they could see veterans. So basically, the face-to-face time expectations increased virtually by 50% during the work week, during a regular 40-hour work week. So that left minimal time to get everything else done that needed to get done in a reasonable time. So it basically burned out counselors. A lot of them started to leave the vet center, which they still do, going into private practice, working for the DOD, retiring early. A lot of them had gone on FMLA leave, going on medication because of the stress, seeking their own therapy because of the stress. And ultimately what this did is it compromised quality care for veterans in the end of it all.
So I can only imagine the reason that this was happening was because the vet center was facing an influx of people. And instead of responding to the influx in people with additional staff, they instead, it's a supply and demand equation. So they instead just expected the counselors to do more.
And you had some counselors, a lot of counselors that had between 100 and 150 on their caseload. And virtually, if you look at ethical standards through the NASW or, other organizations, usually the ratio should be 40 to 50 to 1, clients to counselors. And it far exceeded that. I was between 70 and 80. And there's quite a number of people throughout the system that had a lot more than I did. And it's unethical. And so, a lot of balls can drop through the crack. And eventually what that also does, in spite of the VA's efforts on, rectifying the suicidality situation among veterans, it basically, those kinds of things actually put veterans at higher risk that tend to fall into that category.
Sure.
It's unconscionable.
Right. And it sadly probably makes very good counselors become not so great counselors because they're not able to administer the care and the time. I mean, we all know what it's like when we go to the doctor and
right.
The doctor doesn't have time to see us.
Right. And I personally, refused to basically, compromise the kind of care I was going to provide and give whoever meeting their individual needs I was going to do in spite of the numbers. And so I made this ethical dilemma it put us in. I decided, I'm going to focus on quality care. I'm not going to worry about the numbers. And then I was threatened with a performance and improvement plan kind of thing, which is just a setup to document stuff, eventually to end up firing somebody is what that really comes down to, pure and simple. They'll tell you differently, but
yeah. I mean, that's the purpose of it is for documentation and accountability and to keep a tracker in case there are repeated issues. So was the issue with your performance because you weren't meeting the amount of clients that you were supposed
The
to
visit
do?
count requirement, et cetera. Right.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And when you initially tried to bring this up to your supervisor, because of course we always learn in the military to handle these things at the lowest level first, tell me about what their reaction was.
So basically, across the system, we tried to bring this up. So this all came about in 2016. People are, getting burnt out over the next year. And finally, in 2017, we addressed it through site visits with clinical, regional directors and assistant directors coming down, visiting our vet centers, brought it up, nothing's done over a year. So finally, at the around August, September of 2017, we had an assistant regional director by the name of Dale Willis, and I have no problem dropping dimes because I did in my book, to hold people accountable for what they did. And he's sitting there in this meeting, Dale Willis, assistant regional director, Regional 1 for the Readjustment Counseling Service, and we unanimously told him, this issue is a problem. We've got to do something about it. And he said, I hear this everywhere I go. Well, fine. So what's being done about it? Nothing. So finally, a couple of weeks later at a staff meeting, I gave my notice. And I said, I can't be, part of a dysfunctional organization that's unethically enforcing productivity requirements that are burning us out and ultimately compromising quality care for veterans. So here's my notice, and I will not take on any new clients these next 5 months. I'm going to properly terminate with the clients I have, and I'm not going to be doing any assessments at this point either, since I can't keep these clients because, there's an issue with establishing rapport. Then you do an assessment and then you hand them off to somebody else. You don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
There's ethical situations with that as far as I'm concerned in building the therapeutic relationship. So around January of 2018, I was due to leave around the end of January, early February 2018 to go on terminal leave.
So at this point, you had put in your notice to quit. I'm just trying to clarify. Mm-hmm.
Right. So these next 5 months ensue. I was due to leave like the end of January 2018 and early February, 3 months prior to my official retirement date, because I used all my leave time to leave, and I terminated with clients along the way. So at the end of January of 2018, I went out with an email to the leadership at the central office at the VA for the Vet Center program, the Readjustment Counseling Service, stating the issue in a 6-page email and what the problems are, what needs to be done. And they did not respond. And then what I did a week later, about a week before I left the vet center, is I sent that email out again with amplifying comments, but this time I CC'd everybody in the system on that email. And that's when the fecal material hit the rotary oscillator. And within 36 hours after I did that, they shut down my computer. Mind you, in the meantime, I had gotten 57 responses from 42 different vet centers in 25 states echoing the very issues I were raising. And basically they were saying, yeah, we agree. And they're going into details on how it's impacted them personally, with medication, depression, going on FMLA leave. And that afternoon, when I was reading those emails, that's when I had my defining moment, because I had given them hope that management was maybe going to respond. And therefore, they're kind of looking to me for de facto leadership between the lines. And I'm sitting there. I had to close my door that afternoon reading these emails. I was in tears. I mean, I knew this was bad, but I didn't realize the degree to which it was really impacting these counselors. And it was heartbreaking.
And this was your second salvo in my mind, because the first time was that 3 months before, and you had some time left there, and you still took that risk knowing like, okay, my next 3.5, 4 months aren't going to be so great after sending this email, but I
Right.
need to say something.
Yeah.
And they just didn't respond. So nobody responded to your first email, that first
Right.
one.
But that second one, a week after that, that's when they did with what I was just explaining now. And I'm getting all this, all these stories from people and how what's going on and how, they don't feel leadership cares about them. They don't really care about veterans. They only care about the numbers, the very same things I was raising, the same thing Pete Hegseth was saying about the VA in general. They only care about, the numbers and not really the veterans. And that's really kind of the crux of it. But anyway, so as this was happening, as I said, they shut down my computer. Had they not done that, I would have had hundreds of responses. And so they could see where this was going. So they felt they had to shut me down. And so when that occurred, my director was in cahoots with the management, and she was, making false accusations about me. And over the next few months, she ensued making false accusations, insinuations about me to basically put the fear of my colleagues, or put the fear in them about me being dangerous and threatening, which I'm not. I didn't commit any hostile acts or threaten anybody, during that time. And so, so I leave that following week, and I'm on terminal leave, and this is when I start filing all of these, that end of January, February, March, April. I'm filing all of these documents with federal agencies, the OSC, the OIG, reporting, these discretions. And not only that, but going through the OSC separately in a parallel track about my EEO complaint because of the harassment I was getting and being falsely accused of things which really wasn't true. And it got so bad that the end of March of that year, I had a pulmonary embolism that almost killed me, and I don't have a proclivity for blood clots according to blood tests. So it was that stress and that anger and that rage that really caused that. I was in ICU for 4 days, and subsequent to that, I filed a complaint with Senator Reed's office in Rhode Island, and they took this on, and within several months, he requested the GAO conduct a formal investigation because of the evidence that I provided. I started doing local news broadcasts in the meantime, raising the issue about this. And then the following year, going into 2019, I ended up having the GAO actually started their investigation, which lasted a year. But I also had my first interview with my first national network, which was NBC, the end of May of 2019. And then when I went to an appointment in Senator Reed's office a couple months later, that July, to kind of wrap up, to continue things forward with them through the Veterans Affairs Committee, NBC, catching wind of that, said, hey, you make sure you get a hold of Courtney Cuby, who interviewed you, because basically the end of May of 2019, that one day, they brought a crew up from Washington, turned my home into a studio. They interviewed me for 3 hours. Courtney Cuby, who's their Pentagon correspondent, conducted the interview, and they had me get in touch with her before my appointment with Reed 2 months later in July of 2019, because they had a film, crew filming me walking into that appointment intentionally to get their attention, and it worked, because it got their attention, and so this investigation ensues. It validates my allegations in September of 2020, and then subsequent to that, then there was work that I did with members of Reed's team, and which they were working with the Veterans Affairs Committee, which I had some minimal direct contact with. And this led to congressional legislation that was passed December 2022 as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 5126, Improvement of Vet Centers at the Department of Veterans Affairs that not only addressed the issues that I addressed and what needs to happen for corrective action, they even went beyond the things I raised and things with staffing and getting more people and reducing caseloads and the whole thing. And I'm going back and forth, with little tidbits before the bill actually went to the floor for a vote. And they actually let me, offer edits to the bill before it was finalized and before it went to the floor for a vote.
Did they lower the requirement hours? I mean, the amount of the numbers of patients, the productivity standards.
What did they do? Legislation, they had to start taking steps to reevaluate things, form a working group as instructed in the legislation that was going to look at anonymous feedback in an electronic database that cannot be altered by any party apart from their normal all employee survey every year, which was my idea. They do that so that they can't, so that they can't alter any feedback. And then this working group was to look at that, make recommendations, to the VA secretary through the readjustment counseling service and what corrective action would need to be taken. And then, 90 days after that input, the VA secretary was required to submit a report to Congress about, what's being done for corrective action is basically, how that, was worded in the legislation. And so January of this past year, now they had 1 year before they had to start complying to get their ducks lined up. So this past January, about a year after the legislation was passed, it appeared they were starting to comply with the legislation. I listened to a Senate hearing on vet centers, which I thought touched upon this, but not emphatically enough because there were other things that they were addressing within the VA during that hearing as well. And basically the underlying thing from Senator Tester, who was the chairman of the committee at the time, he from Montana, he basically said, calling out Mike Fisher, the head guy, the chief operating officer of the readjustment counseling service, why have they not taken corrective action and complied with some of the things that were addressed a year ago, separate from my issues, but other things that had happened. So this establishes a track record, how they try to sidestep stuff, not comply, to minimize, deflect, hope things are going to die a slower death, if you will, in some regards. And so I basically sent something off to the Senate and the House Veterans Affairs Committee back this spring, and basically, letting them know, here's what you need to do to ensure they comply, because if you don't, here's what they're going to do.
This is like a fight. This is a fight that keeps going.
So, right. So after that, there was really nothing more I could do. And as part of Whistleblowers of America, whose board of directors I'm now on, and I've known Jackie for 6 years, who's been very supportive. We have annual conferences every year in DC, and I was on a panel with other whistleblowers, with various topics on whistleblowing and the impact and, resources and things that can be done, for your own self-care going through this kind of trauma kind of thing. And, it's just amazing, how and the retaliation that went on is a whole other story. And, 3 years after all this, 3 years after I even addressed this, so I started to in January of 2018, and in March of 2021, I go to the vet center to drop off a memorial donation for a counselor who had died that I used to work with, who was a veteran during the Vietnam era. She was a nurse, and her husband was a captain in the Marine Corps in Vietnam. And the director was not even there that day, comes back the next day, and I found out from two of my colleagues that she was trying to get me no trespass from the vet center. And then she filed a fraudulent report with the VA police that then went to the town of Warwick got me trespassed. It was never investigated. They never talked to the counselors at the vet center that I saw that day when I dropped off the donation. And the things that she said in this report were absolutely atrocious. And my law firm that I hired to get this whole thing debunked and to make this no trespass go away. And thank God that they did, because this could have, backfired on me if this stayed in force, and maybe prevented me from being able to renew my license to practice as a social worker because of background checks they do every 2 years when you have to renew.
Ted, let me just ask you a question. I just want to back up for a minute from the first ways in which you tried to bring this issue up. So you initially, as I understand this, you initially tried to send an email before you quit, not the week before you quit, but or went on terminal leave, but 3-4 months before.
No,
right?
It was a week before I left.
Okay, so
about 2 weeks before I left. But I sent the first email.
So right. That's what I'm asking. So there wasn't anything you formally said about any of this other than just things face to face to supervisors.
No, just about the issue I raised, because the retaliation hadn't started at this point.
Right. So, but at that point, that week before you left, if we back up before that, you had tried to talk to your supervisors about this.
Absolutely.
You had tried to raise it up
using,
there was also a computer database, some kind of a forum that you're supposed to
the regional directors or their assistants would come down on the clinical side, do site visits, and they'd ask how things going. We gave them feedback. This was addressed for a whole year, across the system. Other vet centers counselors were saying the same thing. And lo and behold, it fell on deaf ears. They didn't do anything. And so at that point, it's like, I can't be part of your dysfunctional organization. I gave my notice, as I said, August of 2017, terminate with my clients. And then January of 2018, 2 weeks before I left, I went out with this first email addressing things to the management in DC that didn't address it until I sent it out again and then infoed everybody in the country.
And that's when they responded and took your
Well, they did respond at first before they shut down my computer. And basically all they did is gaslight the situation. Oh, well, didn't address what I brought up. All they said was, well, we have to have a discussion, of course, but about how we have to justify the numbers.
So, Ted, you were already out the door. What made you decide to do this? Because there was a lot of people who would have said, I'm quitting anyway.
Because I have a strong sense of justice and fairness. And when something is wrong and you're hurting your employees that are doing very hard work, that are going to have to live with this afterwards, it was my last attempt to really help bring people together, in a spirit of compassion and cooperation was the tone of my email. And, and because not only was it ultimately affecting quality care for veterans, but you're burning out your counselors and your loyal employees that have done great work, and they deserve better than that. And it's just not right. It's absolutely unethical. And I had to give it my last shot in the hopes that maybe they'll do something. They don't respond. And then that's when I sent it out again with amplifying comments the week before I left. And that's when everything we talked about before ensued,
right.
with Mike Fisher responding, but, basically gaslighting, minimizing, not addressing what I brought up, but how they got to justify the numbers. And it's just like, you've got to be kidding me. And people that saw that and responded to me, I can't, say these expletives that they use even in their emails to me about management. And it was pretty scathing.
And a lot of these people, they needed you to fight for this because they need their jobs and they need to stay there, even if it's going to be a very stressful and a very hard job. And you were in a position now where you were retiring.
Because I took early retirement 3 years earlier than I had intended because of this. But then I also figured I might as well just have one last parting shot and one last word in this, in the hopes that they will embrace what's happening. Everyone's seeing it now since it went out to everybody in the country. So they can't isolate us from vet center to vet center. And then when that happened, it puts them on the spot to be accountable, and they come back, still don't want to be accountable, gaslight the whole thing, shut down my computer within 36 hours. Then everything else that ensued after that did.
But Ted, let me ask you a question and play devil's advocate, because I always like to do this so that people who are watching this know that we are going to go deep into where the tough questions lie. What could the supervision, or what could the bosses have done if they didn't have the funding and the ability to hire more people, or did they? And I think that's where I want to get at. Like, what did you think they could have done that they didn't?
Well, what needed to happen is they needed to hire more counselors. They're unethically already exceeding caseload amounts. For people,
for your professional standards, right. And you knew this, and it was documented.
And so what do? They double down. They don't hire more people. I'll come back to the funding part in a minute, but the idea is, we can't have waiting lists. We can't have. So why expand your eligibility requirements in the middle of all this? That further compounds increasing the caseloads when we need to have more counselors, as it is anyway. And part of, I think, of this, just to try to be fair and balanced, I think part of what they were running into was the challenge with justifying to Congress why, an increase in allocation for this and an allocation for that. And so in the balance of things, they figure, well, if we have our existing counselors do more than they're already doing, we can reduce, the visit appointment problems they're having at the VA medical centers, and being a team player for the entire VA, taking some of this on. And if we're justifying these numbers and people are producing more, well, now we might have more grounds to stand on to maybe have justification for further allocations. Because quite frankly, the VA budget, now, that there's 22 federal agencies, and the VA is the second largest government agency in the United States. The DOD is the first. But when you're looking at $500 billion, not B with a billion, T with a trillion, $500 billion a year for the budget, it's escalated out of control. And this is where you can get into other discussions
about efficiencies,
and some other things that need to happen. We can get into more of that later based on.
But I know what you're trying to say. Like, it's a priority measurement system,
right?
And hard decisions and hard choices should have been made, either with not expanding the eligibility of everyone that wanted to go. Like you said, I didn't even know active duty could go to a vet center. Well, maybe active duty shouldn't go to a vet center. I mean, I'm just using that as an example. I'm not saying I know the answer, but I'm saying those are the kinds of discussions that should have been being able to be had, especially if your professional standards dictated that these were unethical numbers, unethical productivity metrics, then that should have been addressed.
Right. Now, what I would like to do is finish what I had started with the retaliation piece with the time we have left, because this is another parallel track that equally is problematic in any government agency, where people in power continue to, on with their misconduct and abuse of power with impunity, and they're never held accountable. And this is what Whistleblowers of America is trying to do. But in my case, I had already mentioned about, the pulmonary embolism coming out. And I ended up having to go through my own therapeutic intensive for a week to get my own head straight because of the vicious retaliation. And to me, it was more traumatic than any combat experience I had, because of the level of betrayal and moral injury, basically being punished for trying to do the right thing. And it was horrible. And so, because I was in a very deep and dark place, and had this intervention not worked, I don't know what would have happened. That's another story for another day. But as things ensued, as I told you, 3 years after I started this whole thing, in March of 2021, and that no trespass order I'd mentioned before, based on the fraudulent police report to the VA that my director filed. I eventually did get it squashed. It cost me tens of thousands of dollars, but it did get squashed. But I paid a heavy price during it because it just triggered this whole unfairness and unjust retaliation stuff, all over again. And this is typically what happens with whistleblowers. They will try to crush you at any cost and not be accountable. They don't care. They will hold on to their narrative to the death, and it's got to stop. And this is what Whistleblowers of America, through Jackie Garrick, who testifies before Congress on these things, who's the CEO and founder of Whistleblowers of America. And I've been on her board now for a year, and, involved in the annual conferences and with topics that I'd mentioned about, before, and, peer-to-peer support and mentoring other whistleblowers going through what I have, and so on and so on.
Oh, it's a wonderful organization. I just listened to their webinar yesterday, or day before yesterday, I believe, where we had on a VA attorney and his
client. Well, I should have, if you noticed, they, Jack is there. Gee, I wish Ted was here.
She did say that.
And so, and Lashana Moon, who was featured, goes, "Oh, you mean Ted Blickwedel? Oh yeah,
he knew exactly who you were."
So, she and I, have had some contact about what happened, in her case. But, obviously there's a lot of change that systemically needs to be made, because this is a widespread systemic issue, and it's not just within the VA. Although I will say, out of 22 federal agencies, 40% of the complaints of this nature come from the VA.
Really?
Oh, yes. Yes. So, Whistleblowers of America, does great work. And
they do, Ted, and definitely appreciate everything you're saying to speak up and to speak out about these issues. I think it was interesting to me to hear that Jackie's looking at trying to come up with another word for whistleblower. And I thought that was fascinating because
rather than tattletale, snitch, all the negative stuff that comes with it. No, what's a whistleblower? It is a hero, is a person of courage who speaks truth to power, who, the positive synonyms that really go with it is what it's really all about, because of the, of the courage and fortitude it takes for people to take a stand and do this, because it's not for the faint of heart, and it's the road less traveled. And as I well know, when I had to cross the line of departure to go into battle with this whole thing, I'm looking around and wondering, what the fungu is going on here. I'm going into battle, and, where is everybody?
Right. Well, I think that anytime you're a person who speaks up and speaks out about things, you tend not to be surrounded by the same friends that you were when you weren't the whistleblower.
Oh, I found out who my friends were, believe me.
Yeah.
But so subsequently, a little about 15 months ago, I had a book published about this whole affair, which is important to note, because the whole idea here is to raise awareness about these issues. The book and being able to order it can be accessed through the website that's going across the screen right now, vabreakingpromises.com. And not only can you go to a link to go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble to order it, but I even have a media tab in the menu bar that has all my news interviews that occurred over the last several years. Actually, the references for my book actually are in, or I should say on the website in the references tab, because it was just too much physically to put in a book. And so I have the references broken down chapter by chapter, actually, in the references tab of my website. So just to kind of, explain, about that. But the book itself, I went beyond just addressing the issues we talked about here, which was the unethical standards that was burning out counselors and, compromising quality care for veterans. Sure, I went into that in detail, but just as importantly, I paralleled that with the specific retaliation tactics that are used against whistleblowers, which is on purpose. It is standard operating procedure. It's not something by happenstance. And there are certain things that happen with marginalizing, with gaslighting, with mobbing to turn your peers against you,
Mm.
counter accusations, accusing you of the same thing you may be accusing them of or whatever. In my case, their strategy to discredit me was to try to paint me as a mentally unstable combat veteran. That was their basic umbrella strategy, and it obviously didn't work. But in the end, going through that and what those tactics are and allowing myself to be vulnerable, which I didn't like doing. I had a lot of reservation about doing that as the Marine, the impact it had on me emotionally and psychologically. I felt this resistance to wanting to expose my weakness as I thought about it. And yet I thought, you know what? No, people have got to know that this is what happens and this is how it impacts people. And I mentioned Whistleblowers of America as a resource. And then at the end of the book, I have a blueprint that basically explains if you're going to take on these kinds of causes to give hope to whistleblowers and whoever wants to take these things on, here's the things you've got to do for maximum effectiveness to have the most favorable outcome possible. So the book ends on a note of hope. And the next to the last chapter is anonymous quotes that I put in the book that are exactly pulled from the emails I got in response to what I addressed from some of these counselors across the country to show this isn't just me or some disgruntled employee talking. This is a systemic problem. And here's what other people are having to say about it. And I went to great lengths to protect their confidentiality so they didn't face retaliation. And when NBC, using these quotes, sat down at my table for 2 hours reading these emails to verify that, in fact, this is authentic. Even the investigative reporter said, my God, you do this even better than we do. I cannot believe the level of organization and meticulousness you went through, not only to organize this, but to protect your colleagues, by keeping these things anonymous. I still keep those originals, locked up in a safe place.
Well,
I don't know what may happen, and somewhere down the road is going to want to come by and see this authenticated. Well, I can do that.
I think what you've done is you've created a blueprint, like you said, and a path for people who want to choose this road less traveled, that there is hope, there is support. There are others who have gone down this same road as you. And yes, it's painful, it's a slog, but it's also deeply fulfilling that you are in this position now that you can give people who need a lifeline and who need to know that they are not alone, and that when something isn't right, when something is violating the professional standards of care, we as a society have an obligation to make people aware. So my question is, what are the social workers at the vet centers telling you today? Has it gotten any better since this began?
It's actually gotten worse. So as all this was going on, and understanding that VA has a year to start complying with the legislation, so it wasn't until this year they were required to start complying. They did go out with a survey that was required by the legislation to do that. I don't know anything about the feedback they got or what happened with that feedback or what they're doing with it. That's beyond my purview at this point. I've done everything I can do. So for me, this is an end game. There is nothing more I can do about this unless people reach out to me. They want to do a podcast. They want to do an interview. Oh, I'm a whistleblower. I need help. What do you recommend? Sure. People reach out to me about that. I certainly, point them in the direction of resources, not just in dealing with whistleblowing strategies and so on, but also to deal with self-care. Because that's one of the most important things in this process that I failed miserably at, was taking care of myself. And it almost cost me my life, as I had mentioned before. And you got to take care of yourself. And so I have resources I cover with people and places, they can check into and see what resonates with them in dealing with their own trauma and processing, the negative impact that comes from, frankly, the retaliation from speaking truth to power.
Well, just keep doing it, Ted. I mean, that's all we can do. I realize that many of these problems that we talk about on the S.O.S podcast are not issues that are going to be solved in weeks, in months, in years, and maybe sometimes, sadly, even in decades. One of the advocates that worked burn pit legislation was telling me that legislation, I think, took just shy of under 20 years. When I had Carol Baskin on, who is a advocate in the exotic pet and big cat world, the Big Cat Public Safety Act took 20 years to pass. So these slogs to make our government accountable, sadly, do sometimes take years and do sometimes take a coalition of so many people raising the alarm. I mean, we have people now who are fighting the Inspector General system on the active duty side. Walk the Talk Foundation comes to mind. And
have you interviewed Francesca?
Oh, I have. Oh, yeah.
She's fabulous. I met her
Yeah.
in September, and she and I just had a conversation maybe about a week ago. But we met for the first time in DC, and she's doing great things.
She's outstanding.
With the DOD. As I have from the VA and so on. And really it's all about taking care of our veterans in the end. And
Well, and it's interesting, Ted, because I hear about this issues within Veterans Affairs. Obviously, I hear about these issues within DoD, but it does make me wonder, and I know this might be a bit of a sidebar as we close out the call, but what about the Department of Transportation? What about, Health and Human Services? Are they having the same struggles that we in DoD and the VA are?
Not as widely. Well, yes, they do. Proportionately, not as much. But yes, they do. And this is how government bureaucracy
operate.
But I will say this also happens in corporations. And an example of that is Boeing. And the two whistleblowers recently, who I met the lawyer that represented them via live stream at our conference this last September. And this lawyer was obviously distressed. And I reached out to him, because he was on the verge of getting emotional during the conference on this live stream. And I'm thinking, boy, and sure enough, even as a lawyer, you represent whistleblowers. They're coming after you because you're representing them in some way, fashion, or form. And there's some things that happened with him. And the one whistleblower, in fact, they both ended up dead. And the one case, we're not sure whether it was actual suicide or something nefarious happened. And he's had some problems with some harassment, if you will. And I'll just leave it at that. But I dealt with him offline and offered him some resources and things to do to process, the trauma he's experienced from all this.
Wow. So we do have. Yeah, I know. Oh, I was just going to say, this happens in nonprofit world. It happens internationally. I know Jackie does some work overseas.
And this doesn't just affect the whistleblower. It affects their families who also suffer from PTSD. It affects you legally, financially, professionally, at just about every level because of the toxic tactics they use against you.
Well, we did have a few people who joined us. David Jones, he says, get the book. So hopefully he will get the book and more people who are watching this broadcast will definitely get the book. The book, again, as I put in the banner right here, is called Broken Promises. And it's just a really good summary of the steps that you took, Ted. I mean, you have everything from your complaint in there to, like you said, the reactions from some of the people who read your email and were sharing their own stories. And what you basically did, which is what my podcast really was born out of, is this idea that we can't really solve problems unless we're willing to talk about them. And that's ultimately what my entire show is about, is people who are standing up, who are speaking out, and who are willing to have hard conversations and reveal truths that need to be exposed. Because if they're not exposed, then we're not going to fix them and people are going to continue to suffer. And we don't want that to happen when it's entirely avoidable just by understanding what people can and cannot take on and handle. So I do thank you so much, Ted, for coming on to the show Where can people find you and reach out to you if they've got questions or if they are seeking resources?
The best thing to do is, if you could flash the website again,
Yep.
is to go to my website again at www.vabreakingpromises.com, because there is a contact tab in the menu bar by which, if you go there, you can send an email, which will get to me. So if anybody needs to reach out for anything, that's the best way to get a hold of me.
Awesome. Well, Ted, I'm going to go full screen here in a moment, but I definitely will meet you backstage to say goodbye. But I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight on the Stories of Service podcast.
Well, Teresa, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate your willingness to help raise awareness about these issues that are important to our veterans and those that care for them within the VA system. So thank you again.
Thank you. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining me. This week will be my last podcast in the hotel at the Navy Lodge here in Gulfport. After that, I will be taking a trip to Columbus, Ohio, and that is actually where I was born and raised. So I'm going to see my parents while I'm there, but also be interviewing the president of Ohio State University, as well as interviewing a representative from the Veterans Memorial. We have a huge memorial in Columbus, Ohio, so I'm very excited to go there and check it out. I will be hopefully with you guys again after a short Airbnb stay in our new house, and that's where we will build the podcast studio. But thank you so much, as always, for joining us here tonight. As I always close out these calls, please take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.